Okay, so we are back. Hello, everyone. We will hear today from Ratul Dasgupta as our second invited speaker of the day, who will talk about mechanics of dimples and jets from an axisymmetric collapsing wave trough. Ratul, the floor is yours for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes of questions.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Philippe. So let me start by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to be presenting this work. So my name is Ratul, and I am at the Department of Chemical Engineering at IIT Bombay. So you can see the pictures of the students who have contributed to the work. So this talk is going to have two parts to it. The first part was done mostly with my former student, Palash is a former PhD student, and Shashwata is a former MTech student. So the first part of the work was mostly done by Palash and Shashwata. And in the second part, where I'm going to be talking about capillary waves, it was mostly done by this student named Lohit Kayal, who is currently a PhD student working with me. So as Philippe mentioned, the title of my talk is about the mechanics of dimples and jets from axisymmetric collapsing wave troughs. And so we are now going from the previous talks have been about large oceanic scales. So we are going to have a drastic reduction in scales, and we are going to come down to lab scales and scales so small that surface tension is starting to become important. So we will see that there are some interesting things which happen when we have collapsing cavities under these scales. So let me start by showing you some phenomenology of the problem. So I'm going to play a movie, but before I do that, so you can imagine this movie is of a numerical simulation. Okay? So what we have here is these simulations were conducted using the open source code Basilisk. So what we have here is a cylindrical container of radius R0, and we are perturbing. So this is like air above and water below. We don't model really the air. We are just going to model the water. And what we do is we impose a perturbation at time t equal to 0 on the surface. That perturbation is chosen to be in the form of a Bessel function. Okay, so this is A0, J0 of this form. Now, what is LQ and R0? R0, as I told you earlier, is the radius of the container. A0 is the perturbation amplitude. Now, this LQ is a number because this is an inviscid simulation, and because there are boundary conditions which need to be respected at the wall of the container. So LQ cannot be an arbitrary number. So it actually is a set of real numbers. These are basically roots of the first order Bessel function. These are roots of J1. So J1 of LQ is equal to 0. So we know what are LQ. Physically, Q. So Q is an integer. So L1, L2, L3, it will be like that. And L1, L2, L3, and L4, and so on. And each of them will be some real numbers, okay, which are roots of the first order Bessel function. Physically, what this Q implies is that it indicates the number of zero crossings of the initial perturbation. So this is, so epsilon here is defined as A0 into LQ by R0. That's a non-dimensional number. So you can see that as I increase epsilon, my Bessel function gets steeper and taller. Now, physically, Q indicates, here I've chosen Q is equal to 5. So Q indicates the number of zero crossings. So you can see that there are 5 zero crossings of this Bessel function within the domain. Okay, so the wall is somewhere here. And we are going to, I'm going to show you a simulation. So of course, if we take this perturbation and if we put a small enough value of A0, it will just set up a standing wave. It will just go up and down. We have both gravity and capillary surface tension in the simulations. So it's just going to go up and down in the form of a linear standing wave. What we are interested in is what happens as we keep increasing the value of A0. So I'm going to show you a simulation with epsilon is equal to a large value of epsilon. Here epsilon is 1.7. So this movie plays a little bit slowly. So again, the parameters are all air water parameters. So this is air water surface tension, the regular value of gravity. And I would also like to mention that, by here I've said that Q is equal to 5, but by playing around with L, or choosing L to be larger and larger, one can play around with the wavelength of the initial perturbation. Of course, Bessel function is not exactly a periodic function, but if you think of an approximate wavelength as the peak-to-peak distance, by choosing LQ to be sufficiently large, or the value of Q to be sufficiently large, you can actually reduce this peak-to-peak distance. So LQ by R0, you can think of it as a wave number. So now you can see what has happened in the simulation. I'll play it once more. So we started with a Bessel function which was sufficiently steep, and then it generated this. So I'm just going to forward it a little bit. So you'll see a jet shooting out at the center. And I'm going to show you what exactly happens in my next slide. So you can see that this jet shoots up in the center. It actually rises to a height which is quite a bit more than the maximum height of the initial perturbation. And then, if the epsilon is sufficiently large, it can also start ejecting drops from its tip. Okay, so that is the phenomenology of the problem that we want to study and understand. Now, why? So I'm just going to explain, as we increase epsilon, what is seen in our simulation. So as I said earlier, this is our Bessel mode. I have not shown the entire radius of the container. This is a truncated domain. And so, we start with an initial Bessel function. This is relatively moderate values of epsilon, 0.5. And so it becomes a trough. And then as it rises, you get this dimple-like structure. Okay, so this is what we call a dimple. Okay, and you get this dimple-like structure. And this dimple is basically, as you increase epsilon, this dimple actually narrows in horizontal extent. But it also, leads to the birth of what appears like a jet. So as you increase epsilon, this dimple becomes narrower and narrower. But then it also starts shooting up higher and higher. And when we go to epsilon as large as 1.7, it starts actually ejecting the kind of jets that I showed you in the movie earlier. Now, these are all inviscid simulations. Now, the viscous capillary length scale of water is very small. It's about 0.01 micron. So in these simulations, we have, in our theory also, we have ignored viscous effects as a first approximation. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because something very analogous is also observed when bubbles burst. And this is where, this problem becomes relevant even for the open ocean. It's known that bubble bursting due to wave breaking of surface waves is a large source of production of aerosols. So this is a picture of taken from experiments reported here. And you can see that, a similar kind of a structure forms here with a jet which shoot upwards and can eject droplets from its tip. Okay, now I'm going to discuss the physical mechanism of how this happens later on in the second part of this talk. But let me first discuss that how do we model this phenomenon. So as you can see that, as at these values of epsilon, where epsilon is quite large, we cannot model this as a linear problem because, a linear problem, if you start with a Bessel function, as I said earlier, it will just go up and down. It will always stay a Bessel function, and it will just go up and down harmonically in time with the frequency given by the linear dispersion range. So that's not, so linear theory clearly is inadequate to model this. And so we are interested in asking, what is exactly the nonlinear contribution and to what order of nonlinearity do we need to go? Now, the important observation here is that for epsilon, this dimple, which eventually serves as the precursor to this jet, starts appearing at epsilon as low as 0.5. Although at these epsilons, we really don't see a jet, but the dimple already is there. So the basic idea that we had was that because this is a sufficiently, this is epsilon less than 1. So the basic idea was that if we could use epsilon as a perturbation parameter, as a small parameter, and see if we could construct a weakly nonlinear theory, which would at least qualitatively explain what gives birth to these dimples. So that's what I'm going to describe briefly now. So here onwards, I'll slightly shift gears and I'll walk you through, some of the nonlinear calculations that we have done. As I mentioned, this is a inviscid calculation. So we are restricting ourselves to a potential flow. So that's our Laplace equation. It's axisymmetric. Now it's easier to, instead of having a kinematic boundary condition and a Bernoulli equation, it's easier to take the Bernoulli equation and take the total derivative of the Bernoulli equation because there's a gravity term in the Bernoulli equation, which is g eta. And if you take the total derivative capital D by capital dt, then you can incorporate the kinematic boundary condition into that. So that's what we have done. So once we incorporate that, we can use the kinematic boundary condition into the Bernoulli's equation. And that gives us what we call a modified Bernoulli equation. So from here onwards, we are going to ignore the kinematic boundary condition because that is already built into this modified Bernoulli equation. So we have the Laplace equation and we have two boundary conditions at the free surface, which is a modified Bernoulli equation and a Bernoulli equation. Here T is surface tension and G is the regular gravity and so on. Note that there are two curvatures here. This is our regular in-plane curvature, which exists even in 2D. But this is an additional term which comes because of the axisymmetric. So this is an azimuthal curvature term. So I'll talk more about these curvatures because these flows are primarily driven by curvatures, as I'll show you later in the second half of the talk. So now, apart from these boundary conditions, we also need to impose, so we would like to have volume conserving perturbation. So that integral condition basically ensures that the perturbation that we impose is volume conserving. And then we also require conditions at the axis of symmetry. So this and that both applied at r equal to 0 impose symmetry conditions at the axis of symmetry. And then we need boundary conditions at the wall. So this basically says that the wall is a no penetration barrier. So this basically does not allow any normal component of velocity at the wall. And here, this really is a contact line condition. We have really simplified it. We have said that it's a free edge boundary condition. So essentially, the contact line is always constrained to be either a crest or a trough at the cylinder wall. Okay, so this is what it physically implies. Now we have to solve all these equations with the initial condition that my initial perturbation is a Bessel function. Recall that we have chosen q is equal to 5. So L5 has some numerical value. So we have chosen one particular Bessel mode. We have injected one particular Bessel mode into our simulation. And we track the simulation in time. And we ask that can we model whatever happens in simulations using theory. So essentially, we are solving the initial value problem, but we want to go to order epsilon, beyond order epsilon. Epsilon is the small parameter. So we want to go to at least order epsilon square. So once we non-dimensionalize, we can non-dimensionalize these equations using our regular linear scales. So recall that LQ by R0 was like a wave number. So I'm just non-dimensionalizing everything with the wave number. The time is non-dimensionalized using the linear time period of the surface gravity wave. Now here, I would like to mention that we have really used the deep water approximation. So we are looking at waves, we are looking at perturbations whose wavelengths are such that both capillarity and gravity are important for them, but whose wavelengths are sufficiently large such that they are much larger than the capillary viscous length scale of water. So viscosity is unimportant, and these waves are also sufficient. At the same time, these wavelengths are also sufficiently small compared to the depth of the container that we can use the deep water approximation. The deep water approximation is really a matter of convenience here, and it really helps in simplifying algebra at the nonlinear order. Okay, so once we have non-dimensionalized, it basically introduces these non-dimensional parameters in the problem. So one of them is epsilon that we have seen before. This is a non-dimensional measure of the amplitude of perturbation. We also have a parameter that we call sigma. It's like inverse of bond number. It measures the relative strength of surface tension to gravity. And then, as I said earlier, there's also this parameter which is LQ, and this is a non-dimensional measure of the wavelength. So by choosing LQ to be sufficiently large, or rather Q to be sufficiently large, you can make the wavelength of the primary wave that we inject at time t equal to 0 small compared to the cylinder radius. So these are the non-dimensional parameters that we have. And so we proceed using the usual perturbative procedure at order epsilon. So we write all our variables as the following expansion. We also need to expand time because it turns out that the primary mode q is equal to 5 that we inject here has resonant forcing terms, and those need to be eliminated. So for accommodating that, an expansion in time is also necessary. Now, our detail here is that this theory, the second order theory, will actually do this up to order epsilon square. The second order theory actually gives us some singular values. This theory is singular for certain values of sigma. Sigma, remember, is the ratio of surface tension to gravity. This is not so important as far as the mechanics of these dimples are concerned, but I just want to mention that these singularities come from second harmonic resonance for capillary gravity waves. So with that, what we do is we insert these expansions into our governing equation that I discussed earlier. And then we have a Laplace equation at every order. And then we have these two boundary conditions. One of them, this one, is the modified Bernoulli equation. The other one is the regular Bernoulli equation. And then we have all the other conditions that we discussed. The index I indicates the order of epsilon at which we are. Now, once we have this, these are the initial conditions. Once we have this, we also need to express these phi i's at every order in terms of a Fourier series. Okay, so this is what is known as a Fourier Dini series. So it's expanded in terms of Bessel functions. and it's exponential because of deep water, because of the deep water approximation. Now you can pay attention to the fact that these coefficients are what are the real unknowns, okay, and this is what we really seek. And each coefficient has two indices, one subscript and one superscript. The subscript indicates which order of epsilon or which order of approximation we are in. So I is equal to 1 would be linear order, I equal to 2 would be the lowest nonlinear order, and so on. And at every order, we are writing it as an eigenfunction expansion over these things. Okay, so this is the reason. Okay, so I would like to mention here that one of the motivation for choosing a Bessel function as our initial condition was this, that the choice of Bessel function allows us to do this weakly nonlinear analysis. Any other initial condition, although it may appear localized, actually leads to a nonlinear calculation which is far more involved than the current one. Okay, so that is the basic motivation. And as I have shown you, this initial condition of having a single Bessel function also leads to production of jets and dimples that are kind of analogously seen in case of bursting bubbles. Okay, so that's the basic idea, that what can we understand about bursting bubbles by looking at the collapse of a trough which is generated from a single Bessel mode. So now, as I said earlier, we seek these coefficients at every order. And the algebra is a little bit lengthy, but this is broadly the outline. And then you have to insert these expansions. By construction, these expansions ensure that the Laplace equation is already satisfied. The volume conservation condition is already satisfied. These boundary conditions are already satisfied. So the only thing that I really need to worry about is these two conditions. Okay, and these two conditions in turn determine equations for Pi and Ai, Pij and Aij. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any further details of algebra, but it is sufficient to just remember that the equation governing Pi is just a function of time, and Pim here. So these equations, these are generically, they turn out to be simple harmonic oscillatory equations with some forcing on the right hand side. Okay, at linear order, these forcing are all 0. So there are two equations, one which governs P and another which governs A. So if I solve this equation for P, then once I know P, I can use this to determine A. So that's the broad structure of the equation that we solve. So eventually it boils down to solving a ordinary differential equation with constant coefficients. So now once we have done that, we would like to see what is the structure of the solution. So this is the structure of the solution. So as I said earlier, there is a linear solution. At linear solution, we don't expect anything much interesting. It basically says that if you inject a Bessel mode into the problem, because the Bessel function is a radial eigenmode of the problem, it just goes up and down as a standing wave with well-defined nodes. And the frequency with which it goes up and down is given by the linear capillary gravity wave dispersion relation. So this is basically the dispersion relation written in non-dimensional coordinates. So this is basically the capillary gravity wave dispersion relation in deep water. So this is not very interesting because this does not contain anything of what we observe at large values of epsilon. So we obviously need to go beyond epsilon. So now we ask, what are the nonlinear corrections at order epsilon square? And it turns out that the nonlinear corrections are quite complicated. Okay, so broadly they have the following structure. So what it implies is that if we inject energy into one Bessel mode at time t equal to 0, then at nonlinear order, the energy actually gets, if epsilon is sufficiently large, then that energy gradually gets injected into many other modes. So there's an exchange of energy into among modes, which linear theory does not allow. And so an order epsilon square calculation actually tells that there are other modes which are getting excited, although we have excited only one mode initially. Okay, so this contains that. You can see that there are some interesting things here. There's a free mode here, and there is a bound component here that comes because of nonlinearity. Now, having access to these expressions, one can ask that, do these expressions contain what is seen in numerical simulations? So let us compare what we see in our numerical simulations. So what we do here, what I'm plotting here is, for sufficiently small value of epsilon, where I would expect just a linear standing wave, going up and down harmonically in time. So what is plotted here is the dots are from simulation. The red line is from linear theory, order epsilon, and the blue line is order epsilon square. And you can see that they are all literally indistinguishable from each other. This signal is not very interesting. It's just a sine wave. It's just a cosine wave, which is just going up and down. Okay, now let's push epsilon a little bit further. Epsilon is equal to 0.5. So as we push epsilon further, you can see that linear and the other two start deviating. So simulations and order epsilon square starts staying together, almost nearly stay together, while the linear theory shows deviation. Interestingly, even at epsilon 0.5, we do see dimples. Here the interface is actually going down, but we already see the birth of a dimple-like structure, which then order epsilon square calculation is able to capture. At this instant of time, this is what the linear theory prediction would be. It would not predict this. Okay. However, we are more interested in when the interface is coming up, because that's when the dimple gets narrower. And here the theory does not work. Okay, so it's unable to capture. And I'll explain to you later on why this is not able to capture. But notice that this dimple, the dimple that formed here when the interface was going up, is actually narrower compared to this dimple. And this difference of scales is crucial. Okay, so here you see that, although our time signals are kind of matching, but the interface shape around the axis of symmetry is not captured well at the point where there is an inception of a sharp dimple. This is what we call as a sharp dimple. Now let's look at slightly bigger values of epsilon. So the same qualitative trend persists. As we push epsilon to 1.2, strictly speaking, perturbative calculations cannot be done beyond epsilon greater than 1. But here, our expressions don't diverge. So we have stretched these expressions beyond their range of validity just to check how far we can do that. And so although qualitatively they do manage to reproduce the time signal, but quantitatively the accuracy is not great. So you can see that here, somewhere here, when the interface was going down, the order epsilon square theory gets the broad dimple right, just like before. But as the interface starts going up, we get very sharp dimples, and this it cannot capture at all. Now this is important because this dimple, as we saw earlier, when we push epsilon to 1.7, this dimple is the one which will precede the jet which comes out. Okay, so it is necessary, in order to understand what is happening here, it is necessary to be able to at least describe this dimple theoretically, to have a theory which can actually describe the formation of this. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a more detailed comparison of the snapshot, starting with time t equal to 0 for the same epsilon 1.2. So we start. So you can read these figures, first row and then column wise. So initially we start with the Bessel function, and then as it goes down, it already starts forming a dimple-like structure. This is the dimple which the epsilon square theory can capture, but the linear theory does not do anything. And here you can see that a very sharp dimple forms, which the order epsilon square theory cannot capture. Then a jet-like structure, a very narrow jet-like structure forms. As this jet goes upwards, it actually broadens. And once it broadens, the order epsilon square theory once again does well. Okay, so it's the reduction of scales which is the problem. And then at the end of one oscillation, nearly all three become the same: the linear, the order epsilon square, and the simulations, implying that we started with one mode and there was a distribution of energy among modes, but eventually all the energy nearly returned back to the same mode. Okay, so this is where everything comes back and they're all on top of each other at the end of it. Now let us try to understand what exactly is happening here. So if you look at the inset of this is this, and you can see that I don't know whether it's visible here or not, but the order epsilon square theory is unable to capture this dimple at all. Okay, it actually smoothens it out. Okay, so let's try to understand what's happening. So we are asking this question, that why is the second order theory unable to capture a sharp dimple? Okay, by sharp I mean this. Okay, this was the dimple which was formed when the interface was going down. Okay, so this is the sharp dimple which the theory is not able to capture. So for this, what we have done is we have taken the instantaneous shape of the interface. So there are two interfaces, one where this is the broad dimple and this is the sharp dimple. This the theory is able to capture, this the theory is unable to capture. Okay, and from expressing the interface in terms of as a Dini series, we can actually find out what modes are excited in the spectrum at this instant. Okay, so this basically tells us how much of surface energy is present in which Bessel modes. Okay, so this is the prediction. So this is the the magnitude of the mode, and this is the mode index. Okay, these modes are all discrete. So these are the mode indices, and you can see that although we had started with j is equal to 5, all our energy was initially only at j is equal to 5 and nothing else. by the time this broad dimple has formed, the spectrum is pretty wide. So there are many modes which share energy, which have got excited. This is the simulations. Now, what does Thierry predict? So Thierry is able to capture, these energies, but then beyond 10, which is here, there's a sudden decrease, and almost after this, all the coefficients in the theoretical expressions are 0. Now, this 10 is not a coincidence. Okay, this 10 is actually 2 times 5, and 5 was the primary mode. Remember that ours is an order epsilon square calculation. So the generic feature is that if we have energy going into modes which are more than 2 times the primary mode, then the theory is unable to describe that. Okay, so this is a second order theory. So it's not able to capture any transfer of energy to anything beyond 2 times the primary mode. Now, this is the reason why if you do the same analysis for the sharp dimple, which our theory is not able to capture, then you can understand that why it is not able to capture. You can clearly see that, by the time this sharp structure has formed, there is a substantial amount of energy in the in 15th mode. So this is 10, and there is some 15 here and even 20. Okay, and none of these are coefficients which our analytical theory will provide because they are beyond its reach. Okay, so this is the reason why it is not able to capture. Okay, now in the second part of my talk, I will show you that being able to capture these sharp dimples actually require estimation of curvature, or rather the nonlinear contribution to curvature, very accurately. And so that requires at least an order epsilon cube calculation. Okay, so I'll argue in the second part of my talk. So this is a good point to pause, and if anybody has any questions regarding what I have so far, because now I'm going to shift gear and go on to purely capillary waves, where I'll explain to you the same phenomena, but you will find that it's easier to understand the physical origin of these dimples and these jets when we drop gravity from the problem. The theoretical description becomes a little bit easier. Okay, so if there are any questions, you can ask me at this point.
Are there any questions? In either speaking or on the chat?
Yeah, let me just look at the chat.
Doesn't seem to be. Okay, well, I will let you continue.
Okay, so thanks. So now I'll move on to the same phenomena, and I'll show you that the same phenomena qualitatively also happens if we drop gravity from the problem and if we reduce our length scales even more, so that we are looking at waves which are sufficiently small for the deep water approximation to be still good, but these are sufficiently small wavelengths where gravity as a restoring force is irrelevant, and there is dominant restoring force is that of surface tension. So I'm going to again show you a movie, and again here the geometry is the same as before. The only difference is that we now choose a value of p much larger than 5. So recall that choosing p to be larger is equivalent to making the wavelength or the peak to peak distance smaller. So as I'll show you later on, that this choosing the value of p sufficiently large is very important in the strongly nonlinear regime. Okay, but right now let's stick to the weakly nonlinear regime where epsilon is large but not too large. Okay, so I'm going to show you initially a movie where I'll show you a similar phenomena of jetting happening. Here epsilon is actually large, but you can see the dimensions. This container is a 4 millimeter container. The earlier one was a 4 centimeter container. So we have scaled it down by a factor of 10. Okay, and because of this, gravity becomes completely irrelevant as a restoring force. And these are the amplitude of the perturbation, and this is again much greater than the viscous capillary length scale for water. Okay, so 0.01 microns, that is. Okay, so now let me just play this movie. And so the one which doesn't move, the interface which doesn't move, is the initial condition. That's just for reference. And you will see once again that now there is no gravity in the problem, much smaller scales, and once again this will shoot up and form a jet. Most importantly, what you should see, that there is a flat region. So let me play this again. So you can see that there is a flat region, and once again there is a dimple-like structure which is formed. And so we would like to understand that, in the confinement of a pure capillary calculation, can we understand the formation of this dimple? Okay, because this is what is going to give birth to jet as we keep increasing epsilon further and further. So now, in order to physically understand why this happens, it is useful to look at the initial conditions. So what I have done here is there are two initial conditions. One, so this is a Bessel function with small epsilon, and this is a Bessel function with larger epsilon. So essentially, I'm just increasing a naught by a factor of 10. Okay. Now, as I told you earlier, these flows are all curvature-driven flows because initially we don't have any velocity in the fluid. So the flow that appears is just because of the restoring force of surface tension in this case. And surface tension, the force of surface tension is proportional to the local curvature. Okay. Now I have plotted if for these two functions, for these two Bessel modes, I have plotted the curvature here. Okay. Now you can see that if a naught is sufficiently small, this is the shape of the interface. But if I plot the curvature, which is these two terms, the in-plane curvature term and the azimuthal term, then it turns out that the curvature shape is also a Bessel function. This is very easy to see from here, because in a linear approximation, the denominators are all 1. And so this just becomes eta. If eta is J0, this just becomes second derivative of J0 plus 1 by R times the first derivative of J0. And from the Bessel equation, that is proportional to J0. Okay, so this is telling us that, for sufficiently small epsilon, if my interface is a Bessel function, its curvature is also a Bessel function. Now this stops becoming true as I push the amplitude bigger and bigger. As I make the amplitude bigger, this is what the curvature profile looks like. And this is distinctly different from a Bessel function. Okay. So this has contributions from these nonlinear terms. Now, if I take this, the large amplitude Bessel function, which is this, and this is its corresponding curvature, and I decompose it into two parts, one of which comes from the in-plane component and one of which comes from the azimuthal component. Now, the in-plane component has a second derivative. The second derivative actually changes sign. Okay, so this is the in-plane component. Most importantly, you can see that at the point where the Bessel function goes to 0, if my amplitude was sufficiently small, that would have become a node for the standing wave. As I increase my amplitude at this point, 0.02, the in-plane curvature actually changes sign. It becomes negative, whereas the azimuthal curvature stays positive. Okay, so it so turns out that if my Bessel function is sufficiently small in amplitude, these two, the negative part and the positive part at near the node, perfectly cancel each other out. So, okay, so what this implies is that if you start with a sufficiently small amplitude Bessel function with a 0 crossing, that essentially will behave as a node later on. Okay, this is what we learn in linear theory. Now, what happens when we push the amplitude up? The curvature becomes like this, and the contribution, this curve can be decomposed into these two. And now you can see that there are these two contributions. The azimuthal component starts dominating, and they don't perfectly cancel each other. Okay, so if you add these two up, you will get something which is net positive. Contrast this with this yellow curve, which actually goes to 0. So this would just give me a standing wave. This would not give me a standing wave because the curvature here at the 0 crossing is not 0. This implies that we are going to get motion of the 0 crossings as the interface goes down due to surface tension. And you'll see that this is important for physically understanding why this dimple and why these kind of jets arise. Okay, so as I've written here, near the axis of symmetry, the shape is dominated by the in-plane curvature, and at the 0 crossing, the shape is dominated by the azimuthal curvature. Okay, this is true for sufficiently large amplitude Bessel function. For sufficiently small amplitude, near the 0 crossing, they almost nearly cancel each other. Okay, now what does that imply? That implies that at this 0 crossing, for a nonlinear Bessel function, there is a net force. This net force would be nearly 0 for the linear Bessel function, but this is not 0 for the nonlinear Bessel function, and this is going to cause motion of the interface. Okay, in particular, this is going to move the 0 crossings inwards. Okay, so there is a motion of the 0 crossing inwards. Okay, now this is what I have indicated here, and this will give you a sense of why this dimple forms. So what is basically happening is I start with this steep Bessel function, which is zoomed in on the scales, and then it forms a cavity which is indicated by this red. So it goes down and becomes a trough. Okay, with a relatively flat portion. But notice that this is a nonlinear object because the 0 crossings have started moving inwards. The initial 0 crossing at time t equal to 0 was here. And as the wave crest becomes a trough, its 0 crossing has moved inwards. So it's as if these two big waves are kind of coalescing at the axis of symmetry, And their coalescence, at the toe produces a high pressure region which pushes this object up. Okay, so this is the physical mechanism. This is broadly known as wave focusing. And what we are showing here is that this mechanism is known for jets arising from bursting bubbles. Okay, so this is I have taken this picture from this paper which was published in 2002, and this numerically simulates the collapse of a bubble which is about 2 millimeters in size. Okay, so you can see that the cavities are forming, but I would like you to look at this. So just follow my arrow. So I would like you to look at the interface at this instant of time. Okay, so there is this flat region, then a wave, and then another wave. Okay, and at the next instant, it becomes like this, and a small dimple-like structure, develops. Okay, so compare these two with these two. Okay, so now you can understand that why the weakly nonlinear approach is useful, because the weakly nonlinear approach, if it can reproduce this dimple, then it will tell us something about the process of how this dimple forms. Okay, now we can't really do the weakly nonlinear approach for a bubble, because firstly, this is not an initial condition. This is a very complicated initial condition to do a nonlinear calculation on. Okay, so this is where this initial condition is helpful. Okay, and what we are trying to assert is that the qualitatively the same process happens in both the problems, and so one can map this problem onto this and understand something about this from here. Okay, so now let's also ask, how robust is this mechanism? So what I'll show you here is that, we have the same process, just as a illustration, what we have done is we have taken a cavity, but now the cavity is not just a Bessel mode, but it's simpler than the bubble, because the bubble actually has an overhang. If you show the free surface, there is a region where at the same radius there are two heights. Okay, so this actually has an overhang. So we'd like to have a slightly simpler initial condition, and so this is the initial condition. Okay, so this is like a Gaussian with a slight modification, which ensures that this is volume conserving. And so this is a localized perturbation, unlike a Bessel function, okay, which goes all the way to the cylinder wall. And so there's a hump here and there's a cavity here, and we start this purely under the influence of surface tension with zero velocity everywhere, and we let it evolve in time. And our expectation is that this cavity has the same features as the Bessel mode that I showed you earlier, the curvature arguments. Okay, and so the same thing should happen. Okay, and indeed the same thing happens. So you will see that a flat region develops, and then you will see the formation of a dimple-like structure. And if you let this continue, you will get this jet. This here, the A0 was not sufficiently large to get a very sharply rising jet, but you can push the A0 larger and get more dramatic jets. Okay, so this is this illustrates that the phenomena that we are observing in our Bessel mode is not something unique to that problem, but it's generic of a general cavity collapse. So now what we are trying to do is we are trying to set up an order epsilon cube theory. Okay, so earlier I had told you that order epsilon squared theory was not very good at capturing the sharp dimple which was formed, and you can understand reasonably easily why order epsilon squared does not do a very good job. I have already explained it to you from modal analysis, but you can understand it simpler by looking at the two curvature terms. Recall that eta is proportional to the Bessel function with an epsilon here, which is my small parameter. So if you just take these two terms and expand them out, in power series in epsilon, so you just substitute eta as epsilon times J0 and expand it out, then you will see that at order epsilon we get our two curvature terms that we are. So there's a 1 by r which is missing here. Sorry about that. But you will get the two curvature terms at order epsilon. But then the next contribution really comes at order epsilon cube. There's nothing at really order epsilon square. Okay, so this basically tells us that if we want an accurate estimation of nonlinear contributions to curvature, which are important for the sharp dimple, our theory needs to be at least order epsilon cube accurate. Okay, so we need to go beyond epsilon square up to epsilon cube in order to capture the dimple. So this is, we have done this, so the process remains the same. So I'm not going to go through this again. We again do the same thing, except that now our problem is completely governed by surface tension. So the one non-dimensional parameter drops out of the problem. If you recall, there was a non-dimensional parameter named sigma, which was the inverse of Bond number. So there's no sigma anymore, because sigma goes to infinity for this problem, because we have set gravity to 0. Okay, so we now have only two non-dimensional parameters, which is epsilon and LQ. Okay, and we have done the same process, but we now go up to one order higher. Okay, and I'm just straight away going to show you the comparison, and you can see that this is a epsilon. So we are doing this because this is again a weakly nonlinear theory. So we need to restrict ourselves to moderate values of epsilon where a dimple already starts appearing when the interface goes up. And you can see that the order epsilon square interface nearly stays flat. It actually has a small curvature here, but the order epsilon cube does much better. Okay, although it still does not get it completely right. So this is more or less what we can do with a weakly nonlinear approach to studying this problem. Okay. Now, unfortunately, the real interesting regime of this problem is in the strongly nonlinear regime, where epsilon is sufficiently large. And in this problem I have just, for illustration, I've just shown what happens. And if you push epsilon much beyond 1.8, let's say, then we do start getting sharp jets and sharp dimples, but this weakly nonlinear approach does not do a very good job at capturing it quantitatively. So the perturbative approach is not useful here. And so we have been thinking about, is there something useful that we can say about this regime where epsilon is much greater than 1? Particularly because the perturbation approach is not of much use in this regime. And so I'm going to just show you some results here. So it so turns out that if you just do a simple dimensional analysis, then one can without knowing anything, one can write that my interface, independent of whatever be the value of parameters, I should be able to non-dimensionalize. So if the interface eta is a function of space, time, and all the other physical parameters in the problem, then I should be able to non-dimensionalize that expression. Okay. So if I do this non-dimensionalization naively using the linear scales, then this is the way I would do it. Okay, so this is a non-dimensional radius. So r hat is dimensional. So this is a non-dimensional radius r. This is a non-dimensional time. So t hat is dimensional. So this is the linear frequency with which we are multiplying it. And so this is a non-dimensional time. And then there are two non-dimensional parameters, epsilon and LQ. Sigma is not there here anymore. And so there are these two non-dimensional parameters. Okay. So now we were interested in the question that suppose epsilon is much greater than 1 and LP is sufficiently large. Okay. So if LP is sufficiently large, recall that I told you that the wavelength of the primary wave, the peak to peak distance, becomes much smaller compared to the radius of the container. So intuitively, we would expect that the dynamics of how the jet evolves to be independent of the radius of the container, at least for a narrow window of time and space. Okay, what that would imply is that in these scales, if you look at this and these two scales, and if you can see that if I cube this and if I square this, and if I take the ratio of the two, then the ratio is actually independent of LQ as well as R0 hat. Okay, so if I cube this, it becomes LQ cube by R0 cube. And if I square this, there is a LQ cube by R0 cube. If you divide the two, then the ratio becomes independent of this length scale R0, the radius of the container. What that physically means is that there is a, if epsilon is sufficiently large, and that's a regime when our weakly nonlinear approach completely fails. In that regime, it is possible that the problem locally becomes independent of the radius of the container. In that case, these two, the only choice, the only way we can non-dimensionalize the system is if we can we should be able to write the system in this manner. Okay, so the problem becomes a function of, if you cube this and square this, it becomes a function of cube of this r cube by t square. Okay, or in other words, r by t to the power 2/3. Here you have to shift time slightly because t0 here is the time at which the dimple first forms. Okay, now if you use these scales and not new, these scales have been known for these are the very well-known Keller-Mixes scales which were proposed for the collapse of a wedge, the pinch off of a wedge by Keller and Mixes in this very well-known paper. And so the idea is basically the same, that if an important length scale drops out of the problem, then the only way to non-dimensionalize the problem is for the spatial and the temporal variables to combine with each other. And we just tested this on our simulations for epsilon sufficiently large and LP sufficiently large. And this is what we find. Okay, so these are the unscaled plots. Okay, so sorry about that line. So these are the unscaled plots, and these are the scaled variables. Okay, so this is eta and r. So this is r and this is eta. This whole thing is eta. That's a non-dimensional thing. Okay. And so they are evolving in time in a certain manner. And so we hypothesize that, if this is happening self-similarly, then if I scale the problem appropriately, so if I define an eta tilde, which is like that, and an r tilde, which is like that, then the resultant object does not depend on r and r tilde and t separately, but it depends on a combination of them. Okay, and this is indeed what happens. Okay, so you can see that this entire thing, over all these time, this is a single simulation for a single value of epsilon and a particular value of p. Okay, and all of these plots collapse into a single curve. Okay, so this basically is telling us that this is basically telling us the rate at which the interface is evolving. From this we can actually calculate the rate at which the interface is evolving in time. Similarly, if I change L, if I increase L, the value of the index even more, then the same thing happens. The collapse gets even better. Okay, so this basically tells us that the evolution of the jet actually, in this large amplitude regime, this is the strongly nonlinear regime where we can't do any perturbation. Here, at least we can, it is observed that the evolution of the jet happens self-similarly. This is again one more analogy that we have established with the bubble problem. This kind of a self-similar behavior is also known in the case of jets generated from bubble collapse. Okay, so we also have, one can also show that, such similarity solutions are also known in the linear problem. But let me not go into this detail. So if you start with the delta function, if you solve the Cauchy-Poisson problem, one can actually show that the resultant interface actually evolves similarly. Following is exactly the same Cauchy, the Keller mixed scales, and it depends on a single variable, which is r cubed by t square. If, however, we introduce a length scale into the initial condition, then the self-similarity is destroyed. Okay, so this is something that we have shown analytically. So I think I've already taken 45 minutes. So I'm going to now stop, and if there are any questions, I'll take them. So thank you so much for your attention, and thanks once again to the organizers for the opportunity to be presenting this.
Yes, thank you very much, Ratul. Now it's time for questions. There aren't any yet in the chat.
Okay.
So wait a little bit. Just
Ganesh has a question.
Yeah, Ratul, Ganesh here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. With regard to the final part, I was wondering these arguments about the scaling about a local singular point.
Yes,
have also been used in the context of Rayleigh plateau breakup.
Yes.
And I remember there might be an inviscid breakup analysis by Hinch and Lister.
Right.
I was wondering if, given that that's inviscid and it essentially involves the same physics, is it basically the same thing or it's something different?
Yeah, it is basically not exactly the same thing, because you see, if you look at that problem, actually, for the Rayleigh plateau breakup, if you look at their analysis, the self-similarity that happens near the breakup point is actually completely independent of the initial perturbation that you put. So, so if you put any of the unstable mode, that length scale drops out of the problem. And the evolution in time happens in the same manner, independent of what length scale you put initially, the initial perturbation. Okay.
Right.
Now here it is not exactly the same, because you see, although I told you that this and this combined together in a narrow window of space and time, but if you look at these pictures, of collapse, then these two are two different values of L. So 15 and 24. And if you look at the self-similar shape, it is not completely the same. Okay, so initial conditions are not completely forgotten. So the final shape, and this is only within this window of time. If I plot it further, then it stops being self-similar. So we are still trying to understand the origin of why it stops being self-similar beyond this. But the final, this within this window, the collapse shape is not the same. It's only that, you know, for a single simulation, you know, it proceeds in this manner. But these two parameters, the scale form of phi continues to depend on epsilon and LQ. Okay, although, you know, R0 hat and LQ individually drop out of this combination.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
That is my understanding of the analogy.
Thank you.
There are two questions in the chats. So Ratul, you want to read them? Can you read them?
Yeah, so Ramana has a question. So Ramana it's not restricted to odd values of Q, no. So for example, you know, here I have used a even value L24. Does that answer your question?
You can also speak Ramana if you want.
Yes, and Sharath has a question. So he says, I might have missed this, but can you please explain where you have to use the Keller mix scaling? So again, so basically in the regime where epsilon is much greater than 1, this was an hypothesis, you know, so there was no obvious reason to expect it, but the physical intuition was that maybe, you know, locally there is a region of very high pressure, and that evolves independent of, you know, where is the wall of the container. Okay, so if that is true, then, you know, the fact that R0 and LQ appear explicitly in these two have to disappear, and the only way it can disappear is if instead of explicitly depending on R hat and T hat, this problem depends on some combination of these, which gets rid of LQ by R0. Okay, and that's where the Keller so these scales are basically the Keller mix scales. Is that clear, Sharath? Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Yes, you did.
So I think I have answered everything that was there on the chat window.
May I just come back to, I mean, a very general question. So yes. Where do these phenomena apply in either in nature or in, I don't know, in
okay, so
situation?
So this is where it applies, you know. So typically, if you look at, so this is a, you know, so I have showed it in the first slide. So maybe I can go back to this. So if you look at this, this is taken from experiments, and so this is about a 1 millimeter bubble. So what actually happens is in the ocean, you have waves which break and they entrap bubbles, which are large, and because of, you know, ambient turbulence in the upper layer of the ocean, that bubble actually breaks up. Okay, and then some of them rise back to the surface, and as they, you know, they will momentarily persist at the surface, and then they will burst. Now, as they burst, this is what happens. Okay, and then there's a jet which shoots out, and this jet actually eject drops from its tip, and some of those drops, you know, serve as a source of cloud condensation nuclei and so on.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where, you know, this thing. So what we have essentially done is, you know, we have map this problem. We are trying to map this problem into a simpler initial condition and trying to see, you know, if we can understand the physics of this problem from a simpler initial condition involving a single Bessel function.
And are there other situations, maybe not at all geophysics, I don't know, in mixing in industrial, I don't know.
In industrial applications, okay, so, you know, so there is a lot of work on, you know, aroma of, you know, fizzy drinks. You know, there's a paper on bursting of bubbles. So if you look at champagne, for example, you know, it's known that the aroma of champagne is carried by these. If you have a glass of champagne, you know, you will feel any fizzy drink, you know, it will give out tiny droplets. So those droplets are generated through these bubble collapse mechanism. Okay, so the aroma of fizzy drinks gets carried through this mechanism.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. There's a little time for more questions, if any. Otherwise, we'll take a short break. And we will have two contributed talks after the break. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ratul. It was very interesting.
Thanks.
So again, we take a short break.